I'll tell you though, that is relevant to the deep dive I want to do. So we're talking about me doing less as a writer. So the deep dive I wanted to do today was on the topic of the surprising math of doing less. Because when you hear something like I was just talking about, my dream schedule as a writer, the thing that probably hits the attention of the listener first is like, well, that doesn't seem like you're doing that much stuff. That doesn't seem like it's that much work. My argument, and this is something I've been thinking through, especially as I've been developing my thoughts around my philosophy of slow productivity, is that we do too much and we do too much for no good reason. Because if we are careful in thinking about the mathematics of value production, doing less is often the optimal strategy. That's what I want to argue. That doing less can be the optimal strategy. Now, we need some context, like what type of thing do we talk about? What type of work are we talking about? So, to be clear, I'm talking about here, let's say you're in a job where you create things of value. That is what you do for your job. So, I don't know if it's computer code or if it's articles or consulting reports or artwork, whatever. But if you're in a job where ultimately you create something that did not exist before, be it digital, be it physical, and that thing has value that wasn't there before. So you're constructing value by creating things, which is a lot of people and a lot of people who listen to this podcast. If you're in that context, I want to argue a scheduling approach that reduces the amount of things on your plate will actually increase the total amount of value you produce over time. If anything, we can actually trace a curve. We can try to capture these dynamics with a curve. What I think about is what I sometimes call the productivity versus load curve. But imagine for a second that we have some sort of plot. On the x-axis along the bottom, we have the amount of things on your plate, obligations, projects, etc., tasks. And imagine on the y-axis, the vertical axis, we have total value you are producing. I argue what you're going to see is pretty soon that curve is going to peak up and reach a maximum pretty far to the left, pretty far to the not that many things to do. And as you keep moving towards the right, towards more and more things on your plate, that curve is going to come back down. And then it'll be a plateau for a while. And then it'll, once you get to enough stuff on your plate, it'll actually plummet down to almost no value produced. This is the productivity versus load curve. It is not like a lot of people suspect, something that just keeps going up. Do more things, you're finishing more things, each thing brings value. More things completed means more value. You produce more and more value as you do more things. I'm saying, no. You actually reach your peak of value production potential pretty early in the potential scale of how many things you're actually doing. Now, why would that be the case? Well, I'm going to give two categories of explanation. The one category I'm going to call negative reasons, and the other I'm going to call positive reasons. So the negative reasons why continuing to add more to your plate actually reduces your total value production has to do with some things we've already talked about on this show. Negative things that happen. Negative things that happen when you add more and more work on your plate. And the two big ones we've talked about before. I talked about this in our core idea video about slow productivity. I talked about this on my appearance on the Tim Ferriss podcast. The two things that really get bad as you get more and more stuff on your plate is the anxiety of overload and the overhead of overload. So we've talked about this before. The anxiety piece is that we as human beings have this really neat center in our brain. As far as we know, it is unique to humans. We've looked at our close primate relatives and have not found it, at least in the same configuration, but we have this portion in our brain that is good at making long-term plans for the accomplishment of important goals. This separates us from a lot of other animals. How does our brain get us to do things? Well, it makes us feel good when we construct a plan and execute that plan and accomplish the goal, and it makes us feel bad if we don't. If we don't have a plan or we veer away from our plan. And that's what just steers us, evolutionarily speaking, towards actually making plans towards long-term goals. The problem is this center of our brain cannot deal with 600 unread messages and 75 different open obligations on your task list. when it sees 15 columns on your Trello board and each of them is getting longer and longer, you short circuit that portion of your brain's ability to conceive making a plan and executing all these different tasks. And when you short circuit that part of your brain, you flood those negative chemicals. You feel anxious, you feel uneasy, you're feeling that reaction. It's like we're not sticking with our plans because that brain cannot create plans for that much work. It's very artificial. It's very unnatural to have a ton of stuff on your plate. It's hard to produce good work in that state. The second issue I mentioned is overhead. This is very pragmatic. Every obligation on your plate will bring with it a fixed amount of overhead. Emails with people checking in on how it's going, meetings or Zoom calls for status updates, everything on your plate, at least everything beyond a trivial size, brings with it a fixed amount of overhead. There's nothing wrong with that overhead when you're looking at a particular thing you're trying to accomplish. It's good that you can quickly check in with people on email about how it's going. It's good to meet with people on a regular basis to check in. But as you increase the number of things on your plate, the amount of overhead being brought by each thing is the same, and it adds and it compounds. And now most of your time ends up with this unavoidable fixed overhead. I have to answer the emails about the 20 different things going on. Each of these 20 different things has its own Zoom meeting, and it paradoxically, or some might say cruelly, squeezes away the time required to actually do the work. So it's just a pragmatic limitation. The more things you have, the more this overhead, which is useful but does not directly produce value, dominates your schedule. So the amount of literal time left to convert into value is greatly reduced. So those two factors are negative impacts on your ability to produce value. There are also positive impacts. So we said, here's the negative of doing too much. There's positive impacts on doing less. And I think this is something that we intuit, but we don't often capture precisely, which is if you're looking at a particular pursuit, project, or activity, the value of what you produce is going to grow non-linearly with the time you put into it. So, for example, doubling the time you put into a particular creative project doesn't necessarily just double the value you produce. It might significantly more increase that value because it turns out there's these discontinuous jumps in the value of what you're doing as you cross certain thresholds. There's a discontinuous jump as you move, for example, past the amateur threshold in almost any creative pursuit. Once what you're producing is no longer just, oh, I kind of did something, I kind of, this is sort of just an amateur effort, and actually has a professional polish, which takes more time, it significantly jumps up in its potential value to the marketplace. There's another discontinuous jump that happens when you push something to the level that it becomes remarkable, which I mean in the literal sense that now you've added something that's so novel, innovative, or well done that it actually leads people to remark, ooh, look at that. That's interesting. It catches people's attention. Something with that attribute jumps up to another level in value. And all of that requires time. So the more time you put into things, you jump past the amateur level, then you jump past to the remarkable level, and you get this significant, profound increase in the value of what you are producing. And these effects can also be seen through a market analogy. Essentially, the more time you put on something, the more aggressively you essentially pare away the other people who could produce the same level of quality of what you just produced. And as that market gets smaller and smaller, your value jumps up much higher as well. But what this all comes down to is that if you have less things on your plate, you can spend more times on the things that remain. Spending more times on the thing that remain will generate much more value than if you instead spread that same time over many more things. So this is mathematical. If value increases non-linearly with time spent, your best strategy is to put as much time as possible on the fewest number of things. That's just pure mathematics. So let's make this real concrete. If you're writing something, spending almost all your time working on making that thing you're writing really well. So I don't know, you have 20 hours to spend a week. Spending all 20 hours on that is in the end probably going to produce way more value than if you instead spend 5 hours on that, 5 hours on something else, 5 hours on something else, and then 5 individual hours on 5 small things. You can't just take the value of these smaller investments and add them up and get the same as what you would get if you put all that time into the one thing, because when you put all your time to the one thing, you leap past the levels you were before. So we got negative and positive reasons that tell us less is better. You do too much, all these negative things happen to drag you down. You do less, all these positive impacts happen that push up even more the value you produce. So I think this is the situation we're in right now in our current world, especially in the American economic scene, where we have this very large knowledge sector that emphasizes skilled employees with great autonomy to individually produce value. There's so many people who now fall within that type of economic context. And in that situation, almost certainly doing less is better, and no one does. And all of the pressure is towards, can't you just do a little more? Can't you answer one more email? Can't you be on one more Zoom call? It is chaos. It is the Wild West when it comes to how we handle work today. And because of that, we're leaving a lot of value on the table. And I'm going to leave it there, but it is the point I want to make is that we can move beyond simply arguing doing less is good for the human soul, doing more is just the rapacious objective of marauding capitalists. That might be true, but we have this other piece of ammo to use as well, which says actually doing less also produces more value. So it not just makes us happier, not just makes work more sustainable, but it actually increases the value we are able to produce, which makes us again happier. It's all a good cycle. So I'm a huge believer in less. That's at one of the three main tenets of my slow productivity philosophy, which has three pieces: do fewer things, working at a natural pace, obsessing over quality. This is at the beginning of that philosophy: do fewer things. And that's a big reason why I believe that's true. Jesse, this is all just secretly me trying to speak to like my academic my academic peers, like the people who are above me giving me things to do. It's like, just let me do less. It's all just a cry for help. Like we're on a tight schedule today because I have to be on Zoom. You can't be maximizing the value in the world.
Do the people above you work on multiple things, or are they specific?
Oh, it's crazy. If you're in an academic administrative position, every minute of your day is scheduled. At least you have people doing it for you, but it's like being the president.
Yeah.
It's just, okay, here's what's next. Here's what's next.
You get a lot of questions like that from managers and stuff who just want to do more deep work, but they don't have any time blocks to put it in.
Yeah. It's the problem of the entire economy right now. I mean, whatever. This is the major split I think I have with a lot of other commentators, is that we underestimate the degree that these problems come from not knowing how to do this work. We're quick to just, we want an antagonist, so we have someone to fight. So managers are being evil is the instinct. There's a lot of evil managers out there. But even if we had the nicest possible managers who wanted you to thrive, we would still have this overload problem because we don't have the alternatives in place. There's just not enough structure. We just don't think about this stuff. And so I'm doing what I can to help that.